Good morning and welcome back. It's Hans Peter again, and after a short break, we just moved into a new house, so I didn't really have the time to make more videos. But today we have a really exciting topic, Troy. Troy is one of the most famous legends, mythologies that we know, that we've all read about at school, in history class, or somewhere else. What's the story behind it? Was Troy really located where people claim, or was it all completely different again? Today, we're simply going to look at clues, proofs, evidence, connect the dots, and see what comes out of it. And you'll be surprised that, once again, it probably has more to do with the Germanic tribes and peoples than many might suspect. Look at the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Who are they? The Julio-Claudian dynasty, they are the founders of Rome. Julius is considered the founder of Rome. Alba Longa. The Julio-Claudian dynasty originally descends from Aeneas, and Aeneas is said to have been a surviving hero from the story of Troy. Aeneas means, I once again took the trouble to translate it from Old High German. It means nothing other than hero. Oh, look at that. That suggests that he was probably called something completely different, that it's just a synonym, a hero. Just like Herod the Great also simply means hero. Aeneas, after the disaster, the fall of Troy, according to the story, went westward. Likewise, King Odysseus left Troy with his entourage, and he wanted to return home with his companions. And that's where we hear the story of his wanderings. But both stories come from home, from Homer. Aeneas had a son, and he was called Ascanius, but Julius is another name for him. According to Geoffrey of Monmouth, he had a son named Silvius. He, in turn, fathered Brutus of Britain, who was said to have founded Britain. Oh, look at that. Ascanius himself, also called Julius, later became king of Alba Longa, which would become Rome. Aeneas was seriously wounded in Troy during a duel with Diomedes. But he was saved by his mother, none other than Aphrodite. And Diomedes, in fact, I looked it up, is actually an old High German word, and it means nothing other than admirer or lover. Well, look at that. We keep finding these words with the same meaning again and again. Where do these words really come from? What is their etymology? By now, I consider the theory that ancient Troy was located in what is now Turkey to be not entirely correct, or at least not 100% accurate. Let me put it that way. Why? I'll explain that to you now in my following remarks. So let's go on a search for clues and evidence together, my dears. I'm looking forward to it. Okay, now we're going to look for clues, and I've listed a few points. I'll just go through them and then we'll connect them together. Okay? Point one, Xanten. Oh, that's in Germany. After the fall of Troy, the survivors are said to have founded a city that we actually know today as Xanten. And where is it? In Germany. In fact, for a very long time, this city even had the nickname Troja Minor, meaning Little Troy. But this city isn't on the way to Greece, my dears, or on the way from Greece, for that matter, from Turkey to Italy. That would be down to the lower left. But Germany is here. It's a completely different route than the one where Rome was founded. From Troy, Xanthos. There's also an interesting old German word which simply means the white. I also found it interesting that there's a Xanthos in history as well. That really caught my attention. He was once a warrior who stood with his army in Athens and arranged a duel with the ruler of Athens. And according to tradition, that was around 1200 BC. Yeah, and when does the story of Troy take place? Also around 1200 BC, right? Coincidence? Makes you wonder if all of this is really just a coincidence, doesn't it? Or maybe there were several people named Xanthos because they were simply called the Whites. The white means Xanthos. Okay, I bet no one has ever explained these connections to you like this before. And then, just a few kilometers away from Xanten, we come to point number two, a so-called city just a few kilometers from Xanten, namely in what is now Moers. And there's a district there called Asseburg. Originally, it was called Asseburgium. Today, it's Moers Asperg. And according to tradition, who is said to have actually founded this city? None other than Odysseus himself. How is that possible? We know that after losing the war in Troy, Odysseus set out on a long journey home, meaning to Moers Asperg or Moers. Asperg must have been on his route home, or else it just wouldn't make sense if the story is true. But how could that be possible if Troy is in Turkey? And how can it be that the city of Xanten, also called Xanthos, is located in Germany? The same goes for Ascii Bergium. So things are getting pretty tight, aren't they? Now it's really getting tight, but it goes even further. Now let's move on to point three, namely the hero Julius Caesar. He claimed direct descent from Aeneas of Troy, exactly the story that was recounted by Homer. Later on, break time equals 0.5s forward slash none other than the illustrious Emperor Augustus, who was the Emperor of Rome during the time of Jesus Christ, did exactly the same thing. His grandson was the famous Lucius Caesar, and today we know him by the name Jesus. If you've read the book of Jesus Brothers, you know that. And for that reason alone, I find it very interesting to actually trace this lineage back and reveal the true story of Troy and the Ascanian. Ascania is also an important term in German. Just by the way, the term Aeneas actually also comes from Old High German and means nothing other than hero. As I said, we can assume it's a question that all these names in the legend of Troy, just like the biblical texts and many other stories, were changed in order to create a new narrative, similar to what happened with the biblical texts. Even historians, public historians, official historians, believe that the names, if this story really happened, were different and were changed later on. And that's what I always say. Moreover, we know that the story of Odysseus actually took place in the Baltic Sea and parts of the Atlantic, not in the Mediterranean. Even the ancient Egyptians knew this, the priests at least, and the then head of the Library of Alexandria himself stated this. And now let's take a look at something else. Point four is going to be really exciting, Latin. We know that all languages today are based on Latin. So, why is it, strangely enough, that Latin is most similar to German and contains large parts of the old German language? It's quite simple. It's even official that the Latin language comes from Proto Norse. They say Indo Germanic, but what does that imply, India and Germania? That's not correct. One should say Proto Norse. They deliberately and intentionally distorted it and called it Indo Germanic. In English, they even go so far as to remove the word Germanic entirely and create an even bigger narrative by calling it Indo European. That doesn't fit at all, but that's just how it's done. This language was invented and spoken by the Latins, meaning the inhabitants of Latium in Rome. The earliest evidence of this language dates back to the 6th century BC, and it became the official language of the Roman Empire. Okay, we know that. So when someone claims that European languages like Spanish, Italian, and many others originated from Latin, that's only half the truth. They actually originated from Proto-Germanic. And in fact, even Wikipedia itself confirms that Latin originated from Germanic. Is it an old Germanic language? It's also not the case that in all countries based on Latin, the language of the inhabitants was taken away and completely replaced by Latin, because that would have meant taking away the individual peoples and their culture. Okay, their languages were already of ancient Nordic origin beforehand, just like Latin. That's why it was easy to establish. There were always similarities, and that also explains why there are so many similarities between the German language and Latin. The vocabulary suggests a very special closeness between Latin and the Celtic languages. And now I ask, who really were the founders of Rome if the Romans invented this language on the basis of Latin? Based on Germanic, shouldn't they have spoken Germanic? So who were the real founders of Rome? But there is still speculation about whether there was actually a closer, proven genetic relationship between the Romans and the Celts, or whether it was merely a prehistoric language contact. But I don't believe that, because you don't invent a new language based solely on language contact, especially not one that is entirely based on it. I would only do that if I mastered the language and it came from my own roots. Or the fact that many ancestors of the Julian Claudian dynasty were fair skinned, had red or blonde hair, and blue eyes shows that there must have been genetic connections. Right? So if this Aeneas, the hero, was Greek, then the Latin language could never have originated in Rome. It would be based on Greek. Or if Aeneas was the official ancestor, the founder of Rome, then if the roots were Greek, a completely different language would have developed from that. But if Aeneas, as we believe, was of Celtic origin, which is what I advocate, and thus mastered the Germanic language perfectly, then that explains everything at once. It answers all the questions, including how the Latin language arose in Rome, which is based on Germanic. It's really simple. Simple is simple because it's simple, right? But it goes even further. We have many more clues that we can now follow up on. Fifth point, Apollo. What does all of this have to do with Apollo? And who is Apollo? So, the Roman Claudian Julian dynasty claims descent from, I just mentioned it, Aphrodite, but also from Apollo. As I said, I already mentioned Emperor Augustus, who claimed that his mother had a virgin birth. By whom? By Apollo. But is Apollo really a Greek god? Where does he come from? Or was that just renamed? I mean, we know that the original Thor was later called Hercules, and that Thor was also renamed Jupiter, and so on and so forth. They simply adopted the pantheon of others and gave them new names. We can still see that today. For example, if we look at Thursday. For us, Thursday is called Donnerstag. Why? Because of TH, that's Thor's day, and in the south of Germania, Thys, Dona, or Donna, the god of thunder, Donner. That's why we still have it in Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, so Thor's day. It's that simple. We find it again in the English language. We have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. For us, he was called Donner, and then in Latin, among the Romans, he was renamed Jupiter. And that's why in French and Spanish, Thursday is named after Jupiter, because they renamed him from Thor to Jupiter. Jueves in Spanish is named after Jupiter. That's Thursday. And we find this with many others as well. The clues are very clear and obvious, and many old historians have confirmed this too. So, is Apollo really a Greek god? Where did he come from? I mean, we know that the sacred animal of the Atlanteans was the swan. The swan was the sacred animal of the Atlanteans, of Hyperborea, whose inhabitants are often lumped together, but also of Avalon. Even today, countless swans migrate in flocks over Heligoland and the neighboring islands at certain times of the year. We know this. The swan was also the sacred animal of the god Apollo, who only came to Greece with the great migration of the northern peoples. His homeland is described in many ancient texts. It is also said in Greece that Apollo does not come from Greece and that every winter he returns to his homeland riding on a swan. The Hooper swans. We find swans described in many ancient texts. They also appear at the end of the Bronze Age, during the transition to the Iron Age, exactly where the Celtic migration took place, in the north, even on bronze artifacts and rock carvings. You can find swans on sword hilts, razors, necklaces, arm rings, and all kinds of jewelry. It is an ancient Greek tradition that Hooper swans circle the temple of the Hyperborean Apollo. Look at that. And they also circle over Heligoland. Just as old is the tradition that Hooper swans populate the Eridanos, that is, the Ida River, which flows into the sea near Heligoland, bring amber, and mourn Phaeton together with the Heliades. I've written about this in great detail in my books, especially in If Only Our Ancestors Knew, where it's explained exactly. And by now, it should be clear to everyone that it can only be Heligoland. There's also the story of Cygnus. Cygnus was a swan, a close relative of Phaeton, who also mourned Phaeton and was then transformed into a Hooper swan, swimming with other Hooper swans in the Eridanos. We find it everywhere. And the constellation of Eridanus in the sky is exactly identical to the course of the Ida River. Even today, every spring, countless Hooper swans still populate the Eider before they fly on toward the Arctic Circle. There are also accounts of Apollo's journey. There are even pictures on the internet showing the swans with the Hyperboreans and his return after a year to proclaim law and order to the Hellenes. And I mean, even Pythagoras said that the Greeks got their wisdom and knowledge from the ancient Celtic Druids. It all fits together perfectly. And from this, it's easy to deduce and conclude that the law and order of the Greeks originated from these northern peoples. The Greeks themselves confirmed that Apollo was originally a foreigner. So if he traveled to Hyperborea, he was actually returning to his old homeland. It gets really interesting when the chariot Apollo used on his journey is described. And we also find the journey to Hyperborea in the legend of Odysseus. In the end, according to the description of his sailing by the stars, he ends up on Helgoland. This was actually discovered by navigators. So everything points in that direction. The legend of Odysseus was placed in the Mediterranean. And that raises the question, what about the legend of Troy? That one also comes from Homer and was also placed there. I'd like to quote a few passages for you that point to the homeland of Apollo. Very clear. So, Hecataeus lived in the 6th century BC. He wrote, "Beyond the land of the Celts lies an island in the ocean, no smaller than Sicily, stretching to the north. It is inhabited by the Hyperboreans." End of quote. We know that even back then, Heligoland alone was over 100 times larger than it is now, and that the ancient Greeks sometimes referred to Ireland as the land of the Hyperboreans. That was relatively typical in antiquity. Originally, Hyperborea was located elsewhere, but at that time, that's where it was placed. Back then, the land of the Celts actually extended as far as the Weser River. And then we continue with Aristides, who lived around 550 BC and said, I quote, "The Hyperboreans live in the far north, not the east, on the shore of the ocean." End of quote. Damascus wrote around 450 BC. I quote, "Beyond the Riphaean mountains, from which the Boreas blows, the Hyperboreans live at the farthest edge of the ocean." End of quote. Riphaen refers to the Carpathians, the Alps, and Boreas was the north wind. Aelian wrote in the 2nd century BC, I quote, "The Hyperborean island lies in the northern ocean. It is also called Swan Island by the Greeks." Look here, again the hint, because during the festivals of Apollo, countless flocks of swans circle the sanctuary. End of quote. These are the hooper swans that circle around Helgoland in ancient texts. Pliny. Pliny noted in the 1st century AD, I quote, "The Hyperboreans live in the far north by the ocean. The 9th parallel passes through Hyperborea and through Britain." End of quote. I thought, wow, the 9th parallel, that's Egyptian. Originally, the Egyptians divided the earth into 9 circles, the 9 bows, and called the ancient Celts the people of the 9 bows. And the 9th bow corresponds to today's 52nd to 57th degree of northern latitude. That's the North Sea. Crazy, right? More and more evidence. Apollonius of Rhodes wrote the following in the 3rd century BC about the legend of the Eridanus River. Among the Celts, too, there is a legend that the tears, swept into the whirlpools of the Eridanus, come from the son of Leto, Phoebus Apollo, as he shed countless ones when he reached the holy people of Hyperborea. End of quote. By tears, amber is meant, and there are billions of amber tears there, especially at the mouth of the Eider near Heligoland in the northern seas. Well, what more can you say? And here you have to ask yourself the question, this brings us to point 6. Was it all borrowed from Homer? Or does it come from a completely different origin? I mean, most of us know Homer as the writer and poet of Odysseus's adventures. Do Homer's lines really stem from his own thoughts, or did he perhaps draw on old, traditional legends from other cultures? That's more than conceivable. Look, according to the story, Odysseus was held captive by Calypso for 7 years in a cave on an island. Fascinating. It's fascinating to know that Calypso is often referred to as the daughter of Atlas. Topic: Atlantis. After all, Atlas was the firstborn of Poseidon, and Atlas ruled over Atlantis. And that's exactly how it's written in the Odyssey itself, in Odyssey 1, Odyssey 553, and 7245. Calypso first sends Odysseus to the Phaeacians on the island of the Phaeacians. also known as the ancient Atlanteans. And in the Tannhauser saga, you find the same thing in German tradition. It's the same story. Oh, come on, seriously. Another legend about Odysseus is the one about his adventure with the Cyclops. Odysseus arrived at an island surrounded by high cliffs. That's how the story goes. Okay, so there lived a giant, and this giant tore apart some of Odysseus's sailors. But then, after Odysseus got the Cyclops drunk, he was able to escape from the cave. That's the story of Odysseus. But we find the same tales in old Frisian traditions. These are old Frisian legends. What's interesting is that after Odysseus escaped, he told the giant his name, which angered Poseidon. Poseidon was actually the father of this giant, and he caused 11 of Odysseus's ships to be wrecked, with only one ship making it to the island of Aiaia. Yeah. The Ajax are well known to us as the Aesir, and Poseidon is the father of Atlas, who ruled Atlantis. Are you still following? I think it's super exciting. But also Jacob Grimm, we all know him, one of the brothers Grimm. He wrote that the legend of the Cyclops Polyphemus actually has its origins in Norway. And there's another clue. And Carl Scutchard, who wrote many books about Heinrich Schliemann's excavations, think Troy, even he pointed out that the legends of Homer and the old Frisian legends are in incredible agreement with each other. There sits Eratosthenes, who was born in the 3rd century BC, specifically in 275 BC. He was the director of the famous Library of Alexandria, and as early as 300 BC, he actually accused Homer of writing dull fables. Not because they were made up, but because Homer had relocated stories and legends that originated in the far north to southern and western lands. We keep finding more and more evidence, and even the Greeks themselves noticed this. And then, of course, people try to explain it by saying that the Sumerians, listen closely. Who were the Sumerians then? In other words, the northern people who could have brought these legends to Greece. The Sumerians were nothing other than the inhabitants of the Cimbrian Peninsula. Where is the Cimbrian Peninsula? Yes, that's in the north of Germany and Denmark, from Flensburg and up. It's actually still called the Cimbrian Peninsula today, and that's where the Sumerians come from. Then there's a scholar, Dr. Wilhelm Krauss, who wrote in the early years of the 20th century a book about Odysseus and the connections to the old Nordic legends. And he had the following to say about it. I quote, "These are probably ancient native legends of the North, which already existed long before Nordic peoples turned toward Greece and Asia Minor." And that's exactly what I always say, too. I found it very impressive that I came across that there as well. Peoples migrated to Greece and Asia Minor, specifically the Nordic peoples. We can take delight in the rich form that the Germanic legend has achieved in the unsurpassed art of Greek poetry. But that doesn't mean we have to stop considering the core as our own heritage. He knew that, too. Maybe these legends were already being shared in the ancient taverns of Atlantis. Who knows? In his saga about Holy Allion, the royal city of the Trojans, by the way, Troy and Trier used to be called Troy as well. Homer wrote so vividly and realistically that one could assume he was actually describing the holy island of the Northmen, that is, the royal city of the Atlanteans, Basilia. And in Basilia, according to the story, mute swans circle as well, just by the way. And that's why we're going to briefly take another look at Odysseus's journey, because it explains a lot to us. So, how did I come to the conclusion that Odysseus sailed to Atlantis, to the land of the Phaeacians, just as Homer called it? And for that, we'll take a look at the sailing instructions given by the goddess Calypso. From Ogygia, the former director of the navigation school in Bremen, his name is Breusing, found that Homer's nautical details were very well thought out, carefully considered, and actually correspond to reality. Break time equals 0.5 s/, because following Homer's instructions, any sailor today could actually find the way. And for that, we'll read the original text of Homer's sailing instructions. Joyfully, the hero stretched the billowing sails into the wind, then sat at the rudder and skillfully steered across the waves. No sleep closed his watchful eyes as he gazed at the Pleiades, point one, and at Boötes for orientation, who sets late, and at the Bear, reference point three, which others also call the wagon, circling around. His gaze turned toward Orion, clue four, and alone never plunges into the bath of Oceanus. Next clue. For at his departure, the noble goddess Calypso instructed him to always keep the North Star on his left during his journey. 17 days he traversed the vast waters. On the 18th day, more clues appeared. From afar, the shadowy hills of the Phaeacian land emerged, for it was the closest to him, appearing like a shield in the cloud-covered sea. Excerpt from Odysseus 5279. If you take a look at it now, that's actually the route that starts from the Azores, which is a group of islands located in the mid-Atlantic Ocean, and from the Azores, specifically from what appears to be the island of San Miguel, Odysseus steered his course after the rising of the constellation Boötes and also the Pleiades. Break time equals 0.5 s/ from the perspective of San Miguel, which is the largest and most populous island in the Azores archipelago. That would be a navigational course heading north-northeast, a direction which leads directly to the English Channel, and then through this important maritime passage into the North Sea, ultimately arriving at the island of Heligoland. According to Homer, the journey takes 17 days with good weather. On the 18th day, he is said to have caught sight of the land of the Phaeacians. If we again assume that back then, about 100 nautical miles were 1,000 stadia per day, then you actually end up, in terms of nautical miles, right in front of Heligoland. Is that a coincidence? No. And to show you that, just a moment, I need to make it bigger. Here's a picture of the route. I need to enlarge it, the picture. Here we have it. And if we take a close look at this sailing route he took, right here, we see this image. This is the route Odysseus took, from here up to there, exactly to that point. Nautical experts have recreated this and found exactly the same result. Isn't that fascinating? And that once again confirms that all these legends actually come from there. The route of Odysseus, as I said, to Helgoland is 3,110 kilometers, which is 1,680 nautical miles, which equals stadia, which equals 17 days for a ship of that time. If we consider that the Atlanteans, who were primarily a seafaring people, according to Plato used the Mars Stadium, which, funnily enough, also exactly equals 1/10 nautical miles, again, no coincidence, then we can ask ourselves whether this unit of measurement is actually much older, the nautical mile, than we assume, and whether it was originally established by the Atlanteans. 10 stadia are exactly 1 nautical mile, not approximately, since a north wind was blowing when the island of the Phaeacians was reached, see Odyssey 5385. But there were favorable currents, see Odyssey. At 5441, Odysseus is driven to the southern tip of the island, the described island, and disembarks there. So the poet, that is Homer, describes that the river flows from east to west. The river is said to be sacred to a god at line 5455, but he does not specify which one. However, Apollonius reports that it was called Aegeos. Now it gets interesting. The Eider, which is located not far from the southern tip of Heligoland, flows from east to west. In the Middle Ages, the Eider also had another name, namely Aegisdora or Aegisdora, named after the god. And this god was still worshipped in Christian times with a temple on Heligoland. Really. And now it actually gets even more exciting. This is truly one revelation after another. We cannot, if we haven't already, after the next argument that's coming up, deny the identity of the Fiat Island with Hellsoul and Heligoland, just like Basilia. It's not possible. Namely, when Odysseus wants to set foot on the land, suddenly he is no longer able to, because the direction of the river's current changes. Odysseus is said to have pleaded with the god of the river, and a miracle happened. The current subsides. Odysseus was able to set foot on the land. What actually happened here? A miracle. Was God involved? No. Here, Odysseus or Homer is describing something he didn't know because he was at the Mediterranean Sea. He is describing the tides, the tidal currents. But there are no tidal currents anywhere in the entire Mediterranean, which means the island of the Phaeacians could never have been located in the Mediterranean. And now it becomes clear and obvious that the story in the Odyssey is not a product of fantasy. A Greek would never have come up with a detail like a tidal current in his imagination because he simply didn't know about it. And this description must have seemed like a miracle to him because he didn't know about it. The first Greek to officially describe a tidal current, I checked, was Pytheas, for centuries after Homer. How did Homer know about it? He simply repeated it. He didn't know it himself. He copied it from the ancient Nordic sagas, from the Frisian legends. The clues in the Odyssey are actually quite clear. For example, in Odyssey 5460, it says Odysseus threw the veil back into the salty waves of the river. In Odyssey 855, it says that there was high tide in the harbor. And that also suggests that there must have been low tide as well. And all of this hardly points to poetic inspiration, but rather quite clearly and unmistakably that Homer must have had access to travel journals and sailing manuals. Well, probably not him, but those who originally wrote them. Okay. Homer also speaks in Odyssey 6264 of double-curved boats. Now it gets interesting. Double-curved boats. Where did these boats exist? If we look at the ships of the Norsemen, we see a steeply rising, curved prow at the bow and stern, and only there did they have double prows. In Medinet, in Habu, in Medinet Habu in Egypt, there we see depictions of these Norsemen's boats, and that is also confirmed there. We also see them on the reliefs in Medinet Habu, some of the ships of the Norsemen with their masts laid down, a mast that has been laid down. And Homer writes about this in Odyssey 852, namely, there, in Odyssey 837, Homer mentions that the oars were hung on leather swivels. That is still common practice today in the North Sea region. You see, with the Mediterranean story, things are really starting to get more than just tight, especially with Xanten, Mowers, ASCII, Bergium. It is also well known that the Mediterranean peoples did not like to sail through the salt sea, whereas the Phaeacians are described as a people who, with joyful courage, sailed to the most remote coasts of the earth, which really doesn't fit the Mediterranean at all, right? It also says that for 4 years they didn't care about quivers and bows. No, I thought to myself, another clue. We only know that from the North Sea peoples. If we now just take all these clues we've already mentioned and connect the dots, well, then the story really gets tight. No, it doesn't get tight. It becomes unbelievable. And we've actually not only proven the implausibility that it took place in the Mediterranean region, we've even shown where it actually happened. So if we can now assume that much, if not all, of the stories about Odysseus actually took place in the Baltic Sea and the North Sea, then we should really take another closer look at the legend of Troy and Homer, and let our minds wander. We should allow ourselves to be open minded, to open our minds to new things, and simply be free spirits. And that's why we're now coming to the topic of the Peloponnese and Pharos. Wow, that's really exciting too. The Italian physicist Felice Vinci raised the question of whether the settlement excavated by Heinrich Schliemann and Anatolian Isarlik was actually Troy. Because if we relocate some of the legends of Odysseus to the Baltic Sea region, and according to Tacitus, he was said to have been active in the lands of Germania, which Tacitus himself even confirmed, then we are also allowed to ask whether the legend of Troy might have taken place there as well. And Vinci himself actually relocated the events surrounding Troy to the Baltic Sea, specifically to the area between Denmark, the land, the mark of the Danes, and Finland. And through the reports about Atlantis, the impact of a celestial body near Helgoland, and the resulting catastrophe and migration of the northern peoples, we have determined that our ancestors immigrated to Asia Minor and Greece, bringing with them not only their knowledge, but also their myths, legends, and stories. There are a great many geographical inconsistencies that Vinci addresses. For example, in Homer's accounts regarding the Peloponnese, there is repeated mention of a flat landscape, but the Greek Peloponnese is anything but flat. It is extremely hilly. The island of Pharos, located at the entrance to the harbor of Alexandria, where the famous lighthouse is said to have stood, is, according to Homer, a day's journey from Egypt. But in reality, it's only a few minutes away. That doesn't add up either. When we look at the term Pharos, what comes to my mind are the FOA, Pharos, fodder, and these islands, Pharos, FOA, the Foyen Islands, belong to Denmark. Furthermore, near the island of Gotland, there is another island called Faroe. Coincidence? I'm really not so sure anymore. Are you? Point 9. It is described. A battle at night and double-tailed ships, clearly Nordic ships. Viking ships had double tails, no others did. Battle at night. In Homer, the legends speak of a harsh climate. A harsh climate with mention of fog. That doesn't exist in the Mediterranean, cold, and the possibility of fighting battles at night. Wait, the possibility of fighting battles at night. Those aren't typical characteristics of the Mediterranean. Those are typical characteristics of the Baltic Sea, all of which are described here. Also, especially in the northern latitudes, the sun never fully sets in summer, which makes battles at night possible. The end. Is there anything else to add here? No. Likewise, as already mentioned in this book, the double-tailed ships with high prows of the Archaea are described. These ships could be steered just as well forward as backward. Yes, because of the double prow. There wasn't really a true front or back, since both ends were designed the same. And these are the ships of the northern peoples and no others. 10th, we find further compelling evidence in the accounts of the Dane Saxo Grammaticus, whose stories inevitably remind one of Odysseus. There's no other way. According to the author of the book, some passages even match by pure coincidence. But in Saxo Grammaticus, we also find the explanation for the Hellespontia, which were sought in vain during the Middle Ages. The very word Hellenes already points to Northern Europe. The goddess Helgoland, Hel, Heil, Hel. These are Nordic terms. That means the name of Greece also comes from the far north. The Hellespontians lived on the eastern coast of the Baltic Sea, in what is now Lithuania, at the truly wide Hellespont, which later became known as the Gulf of Finland. Helsinki is also located on the Baltic Sea. Where do all these people in Helena come from? Point 11. We have even more evidence. In Homer's account, the king of the PH says that they are closest in blood and lineage to the Danans. Isn't that a reference to the people of the Danes, the people of Dan? Homer describes two peoples attacking Troy. On the one hand, the Danes, also called Dania, and on the other, the Achaeans. And the author Gerd Meyer equates the Achaeans with the Archazids. And where do they come from? The Archazids? From the east coast of Jutland. The Baltic Sea. And where does the Rhine flow? The city of mowers is on the Rhine. Askeburg is on the Rhine. Xanten is on the Rhine. It flows into the North Sea. It's all pretty clear and obvious. Point 12, King Priam, the famous king of Troy. In Homer's legend, he was the king of Troy. In the 7th century AD, the chronicler Fredegar reported that the Franks, were once ruled by King Priam from Troy. The Franks were ruled by King Priam from Troy. So was Troy really located in Greece? King Priam of Troy is said to have ruled over the Franks before they eventually set out under Fredegar's break time equals 0.5s/ and went on to found a new Troy on the Rhine. Xanten, Troy Minor. We're talking here about the small Troy of that time, meaning Xanten in Germany on the Rhine. And it's very revealing that the word Priamus, well, how could it be otherwise? Of course, I also looked up what the word Priamus means in Old High German. And do you know what it means? It simply means ruler, leader. It doesn't mean table or bed leader. All the translations from Old High German make perfect sense and fit 100%. Priamus means ruler, leader. We also find the word Odysseus in Old High German. It's very revealing because Odyssey translates from Old High German as journey, wandering, adventure. Journey, wandering, adventure. What was Odysseus's journey? An adventure, a wandering, a journey. So he wasn't even called Odysseus. That's just a term. Agamemnon, for example, who was a very important protagonist in Troy, carries the root word aga. Agamemnon. And aga means father, hid in Old High German. Coincidence. The kidnapped bride Helena also has a German name. Hello, hello, hello. The luminous Helena means, by implication, the luminous one from the German island of Heligoland, Helsinki. Goddess Hel. Do we need more proof? Well, now look, official historians of course doubt all of this, especially with the argument that it doesn't hold up, that there are no solid archaeological excavations to support it. Hey, that may be true. However, we should note that at the place we now call Troy, no sign was found that says Troy on it either. No, there isn't. Nothing has been found in terms of writings or engravings that clearly prove it was Troy either. It's just an assumption that people have agreed upon. There's only a theory that everyone has settled on. And in the far north, it's actually difficult to find excavations for the following reasons. For one thing, the sea level was different thousands of years ago than it is today. And furthermore, around 1200 BC, there was a major natural disaster that destroyed a lot of archaeological evidence. It's that simple. And above all, hardly anyone has bothered to seriously search there so far. That's the next thing. And in Germany, we still have hundreds of megalithic sites from the Bronze Age. We know that, and they haven't been excavated. They don't want to. On the contrary. In fact, amateur archaeologists keep discovering such sites, and then they are deliberately buried. Entrances are blown up, entrances are collapsed, tunnels are blasted. Apparently, they don't want us to find such outstanding and historical evidence in Germany. They want to prevent it because it would call all previous assumptions into question and trace everything back to the Germanic tribes and peoples and the Nordic tribes and peoples. Let's remember that Pastor Spanat published in his books that ancient smelting furnaces for iron production were found on the North Sea coast, which date far back into the Bronze Age. These shouldn't even exist. The Iron Age officially began in 1200 BC in the Mediterranean region. That's how the whole story is told to us. And that's a lie. It's a half-truth. Yes, the first traces of iron smelting were found in 1200 BC in the Mediterranean region. Correct. And that's because during the Great Migration of the Celts from the far north around 1200 BC, these appeared there. Were brought to the Mediterranean. The smelting furnaces that you find or found at the North Sea are much older, from the Bronze Age. Still, history isn't rewritten. Shouldn't everything here really undergo a fundamental revision? That's just something you have to ask. And the migrations of the old Celtic peoples and tribes seem to have already taken place long before that. Even the Jewish Times has admitted that as early as 6000 BC, Celts were present in the Levant. The Rosicrucians believed that Akhenaten and Nefertiti's ancestors all came from Ireland and Scotland, and that these people actually represented the true Israelites. Are the Rosicrucians just imagining this, or is there actually a grain of truth to it? I wrote about this in my book, The Path of Truth. No, the path of initiation. Akhenaten and Nefertiti, their true story. Modern genetic analyses of the mummy from Tutankhamun's tomb, in Egypt, I've mentioned it in many posts, showed that the genetic haplogroup is R1b2, or rather, RM269. So, the one lying in Tutankhamun's tomb is actually a Scot or an Irishman. So, were the Rosicrucians right after all? Akhenaten and Nefertiti ruled until around 1340 BC. They then went into exile in Ireland, and their son Tutankhamun followed them. So, someone completely different is lying in that tomb. I've described it in the book. During the reign of Moses, his father, namely Ramses III, there was a great battle. Celtic tribes marched in the 13th century and the 12th century through Europe, conquered the Hittite Empire in just a few weeks. Afterwards, together with their Libyan allies, they marched against Egypt, where they fought the famous battle against Ramses III. They lost the Battle of Medinet Habu, but they were not killed. They were allowed to settle in the surrounding area, which implies that there must have been negotiations and discussions afterwards. They settled in Egypt and the neighboring countries, and there they became known as the Philistines. We've clarified where the Nubal people, where the ninth Baal was located, came from. They were the namesakes of today's country. Attention, Palestine, Philistine. It was the Philistines, the northern peoples, who gave Palestine its name. And this happened around 1180 BC, and it was also around this time that Moses was born. And the name of these ancient Celtic wanderers is now obscured in the term Urnfield culture. That's how it's said nowadays. It was nothing other than old Celts wandering around, because the name Urnfield people comes from the custom of keeping the ashes of the cremated dead in decorated clay urns and burying them in the fields. Well, they had to do that since they were on the move. That was the reason. They couldn't build large megalithic tombs like they did back home, not beforehand. It's that simple. And the megalithic structures of the ancient Celts go far back into the Bronze Age and contained great cosmic knowledge and wisdom long before anything we call the Roman Empire or the Greek Empire. The only ones who could match them were the Egyptians and parts of Mesopotamia. But in Egypt, the corruption of the priests was in full swing, and the truth was no longer revealed or communicated, same in Mesopotamia, the only region at the time of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Very important, the only place where this old Atlantean knowledge was still fully preserved was among the Celts, the Gauls, and the Germanic tribes. That's why they had to be fought, killed, slaughtered, and removed. A sad, genocidal chapter of history was opened and carried out, all the way into the Middle Ages. You know, white women were burned, men were hunted, there was torture, people were quartered, burned, drowned. You don't even want to think about it, because the echo of this karma still resonates today in the genes of the Germanic tribes and peoples. Further attempts to destroy ancient knowledge, wisdom, writings, buildings, and descendants of these peoples included the destruction of the Templars, other lineages who stood for the truth, also the Ariana, the 30 Years' War, and the First and Second World Wars. Well, Lucius Caesar and Julia the Younger both came from the Julian-Claudian dynasty and were the same. Descendants of Aeneas. Hold on tight. And the Steinstamber, he apparently seems to come from Northern Europe. Who were Lucius Caesar and Julia the Younger? Jesus and Mary Magdalene. We also know that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had reddish hair and blue eyes, and their ancestors came from the far north. They also had children in Scotland, were at the chapel in Iona, and traveled everywhere. And that also seems to be the reason why, after the official crucifixion, she returned to the homeland of her ancestors, since the Roman Empire had less influence there and they were safer there. That's how it was revealed. Well, for me, this was a video that I had wanted to make for a very, very, very long time because it really reveals completely new things. New historical aspects that might finally make their way into history books and school lessons. We ask questions, we find answers. Have a blessed week. All the best from the heart. Ciao.